Hello guys and welcome back to FATBOSS TV. Today we're having a look at Sludgefist in Castle Nathria.
Yes, this is one of the later bosses in the instance, and it's a patchwork style fight where you have to deal with basic mechanics whilst fighting against an Enrage timer. But before we inevitably go off on one saying how much we don't like patchwork style fights, this one's actually pretty cool, so let's go through the abilities and mechanics.
So the boss slowly gains rage, and after around 60 seconds he'll reach full and cast Hateful Gaze on the tank. The boss will charge towards the tank after 6 seconds and will continue past him until he hits an object, dealing lethal damage to all players in his way. If he hits a wall, the raid will take unhealable raid-wide damage, essentially wiping you. However, if he hits one of the 4 pillars in the middle of the room, it will destroy the pillar, stun him, and increase the damage he takes by 100% for 12 seconds, whilst dealing far more survivable raid damage. So when you're targeted by the charge as a tank, you'll want to move behind a pillar, the boss will hit it, get stunned, reset his rage, and the fight will continue from there. As there are 4 pillars and he casts the charge every 60 seconds or so, you essentially have 5 minutes to kill the boss, as the final charge is guaranteed to hit a wall, which will quickly wipe you. For your tanks to also deal with is the boss's giant fists. This makes all melee attacks also hit the closest player within 5 yards, and if no one is there, it'll instead hit the main tank twice. So tanks need to make sure they remain on top of each other for the entire fight. Tanks also need to be very careful with boss positioning because of his destructive Stomp. When cast, this makes a large targeting circle around the boss that will do a huge amount of damage to anyone that's caught. This will also destroy any pillars within the circle, so it's vital that you never tank Sludgefist too close to the pillars.
Now for the rest of the raid to worry about is the chain link. This is applied to random players linking one to another after around 6 seconds. This deals very light ticking damage over 56 seconds, but most importantly, if you ever move too far apart from each other, you will take a massive lethal burst of physical damage, and if you manage to somehow survive that, you'll also be stunned for 6 seconds. So chained players, you'll need to make sure you go to your pairs and stay within your pairs until your chains time out. The game is generally pretty kind when making chain partners. Typically melee are shackled with other melee and ranged are shackled with other ranged, and if this does go on your tanks, the tanks will be chained together. Now there are 3 other abilities the raid needs to deal with that become slightly more difficult when you take into account that you're chained to one another. The boss will knock everyone back and deal a moderate burst of damage when he casts Colossal Roar. He'll do this immediately on the pull and then semi-frequently throughout the fight. If chain players aren't too close to each other, they will just be slowly pushed away from each other and the chain will snap. So make sure you're pretty close to one another when this ability is cast. Falling Rubble will occasionally fall from the ceiling, creating small targeting circles that will deal a burst of physical damage and stun all players within for 2 seconds. This also leaves behind a patch that reduces movement speed whilst dealing ticking damage. These will always spawn underneath players generally ranged, so you've got to be quick to move from them, and ideally you'd move in the same direction as your chained partner. Last to mention is the Chain Slam. This roots a player for 4 seconds and then drags them to the boss afterwards, dealing a huge burst of physical damage to them. However, this damage is split between all players within the targeting circle around the rooted player. We found that 4 players was enough to make the damage really easily survivable. Just make sure that if you are going to go in there and you're chained with someone else, make sure your partner comes with you. The only other mechanic to note is that the boss will get a soft Enrage at 20% health, gaining 20% increased damage and attack speed. This alone doesn't sound too bad, but taking into account that each pillar makes it so the raid has a small dot on them, right towards the end of the fight you might have 4 dots and the boss is going a bit nuts, so healers you've really got to be on your A game.
As for the mythic version of the encounter, the immediate most noticeable difference is that your entire raid is placed in chains rather than just a few of you. This is made worse as a new ability is introduced called Seismic Shift. This places a debuff on the entire raid, causing all players to erupt after 4 seconds, dealing a burst of physical damage to all players within 4 yards of them. So this forces your raid to spread out, but you still have to remain within 12 yards of your chain partner, otherwise you're going to snap and die. To add, at least 4 players have to be hit by the chain slam on the rooted player, otherwise the boss will instantly gain 100 rage and begin to charge at your tank. So this essentially stops you from cheesing the ability using immunities or large damage reductions. As for the charge itself, when the boss does hit a pillar, shards will fly off from it, creating targeting circles, and if they're left unsoaked, the raid will take a lethal burst of physical damage. So you must soak the 4 circles that spawn from each pillar that is destroyed, and then the 2 additional smaller circles that spawn from the initial zones. But that's the fight. What's our thoughts?
So historically, patchwork fights me and you aren't massive fans of, let's just say that politely. But this one I actually think could be very good if done correctly. Let's talk about normal and heroic real quick because, patchwork fights on those sort of things. The DPS check isn't going to be too much of a big deal, and you kind of go in, as long as you do the fight correctly.
Stay alive, and the boss will die, yeah.
But this boss has got a lot of interesting things. The fact that it takes place in the first room, again, you could call that lazy. But the fact that they reuse the pillars in unique ways. Of course, the first boss, you're hiding behind the pillars from the giant Shriekwing bat. And then this time, you're using the boss to destroy the pillars and take down the castle and all of that. It uses the encounter space in a different way, using the same tools, which is very cool, I think.
And it's an amazing way of actually showing the Enrage timer.
Yeah, physically within the space. Yeah. You know there are no more pillars left. You know that the next charger is coming in. You might want to line up the boss so he charges the longest distance to try and before he slams into the wall and you're going to die super quickly. It's going to be really intense, if it gets to that point, obviously, depending on tuning. But I think that's a really cool way of doing it. Also, I think this fight has a lot of neat little things for the damage halls out there, mainly that small window when he crashes into a pillar. The fact that he takes that extra damage, I think a lot of those sort of DPS pushing players will enjoy trying to save resources for it or just generally lining up their damage just to make the most of those small little burst windows. So it kind of rewards those players. Some patchwork fights, it's hit the boss, do your damage. This one actually has that little variation in it, so to kind of keep those people interested as well. And of course, the star of the show for this fight, mechanically speaking, is Chainlink. Without it, there is no encounter for me, at least.
Yeah.
When doing this fight in the first few weeks, you know that people are just going to go in completely separate directions when dodging a mechanic, and people are going to die, or you're just going to pop a massive damage reduction. Immunities don't work, but if you pop a massive damage reduction, you just run away from your partner just to screw them over so they die and you just survive the stun. I should probably not be saying this, actually, because otherwise people are just going to be going out there and doing it.
And you say that immunities don't work. They didn't work on the most recent test.
Yeah, it's been variable. We're not entirely sure. Either way, don't be horrible to your friends. Thank you. Especially if you're chain linked with me. But I think our main issues really come down to Mythic in terms of its positioning within the instance. The fact that it is 8th, it's something to be concerned about just because I hate really tight DPS checks, especially on a fight that's as fragile as this. One false step could have people die, if you've gone the wrong way with your chains. One false step when the pillar gets destroyed and you don't soak in time, your entire team's going to wipe. So that should be the difficult part of the fight. Getting through and used to how one another work in an entirely random environment. Me and you aren't going to be paired every single time. You and your favorite person to be paired with aren't going to be paired with each other. You've got to learn to work with each other, maybe make a set of rules in which you can try and follow. But if you add on top of that a really tight damage check, it's going to be so unforgiving and it's just going to be brutal, and if you don't have the gear for it, you just have to come back the next week and all this. It's just nasty. If you survive the fight and you do all the mechanics correctly, for a fight like this, I think it's fine that you kill it. You should get a pat on the back. Well done, boss is dead. Just like Maiden of Virtue in Tomb of Sargeras. As long as you soak those orbs, you could have 2 people die at the beginning of the fight, of first week, when you got to that boss. It was just do the fight correctly, and the boss will die.
Yeah, this is where I slightly disagree with you on, because I feel like there isn't anything mechanically demanding enough going on in the encounter that the fight isn't going to be tuned in such a way where it's going to be a really tight check on Mythic. And the only reason I think that is because it's 8th. There's no way you get a boss like this that's 8th in the instance and it's this easy. Because sure, the chain mechanic, there is quite a lot of things you need to get used to, but once you do eventually get used to it, which might only take 5 pulls, maybe 10, maybe 15, it's not going to take a lot, I don't think. Once you've got that down, there isn't really anything else going on.
I think that then leads you to the opportunity of then trying to optimize damage. And I think if the boss requires somewhat optimized damage, I'm not talking like 99th, 100th percentile things to get it down, but as long as you need to do your, somewhat good damage, and you might need to work with people in different ways in order to try and optimize people's DPS in that sort of manner. If the boss then dies because of that, then I don't think it's too bad. But I'm kind of with you.
But what I'm scared about is it not being that case, where it's literally you need more gear.
Yeah, of course.
And when you've already done heroic splits and you've already done a shitload of Mythic Plus, and you're saved that week, and you now have to wait 5 days, it's like, oh,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah, it's a little bit lame.
5 days or until it's nerfed. And that's happened loads of times before in the past. Most recently it happened with Fetid Devourer in BFA. So I really hope they don't do it that way. And if they don't do it that way, then the fight is just going to be easy. That's how I look at it. That's how I feel this encounter is going to be. And considering it's 8th, that doesn't seem right to me. I'd prefer they just made this boss 2nd. It's in the same room as the first boss. Fuck it, why not? Just make him to come down 2nd. I know he's supposed to be like destroying the walls and everything's collapsing down in the castle.
You just be going doing Dark Vein and just this crumbling around you and shit. So what's going on?
So, there is that concern, because I don't think there's enough going on mechanically to really test you for an 8th boss. And I'm not saying that, sure, it needs to be ridiculously hard. They need to introduce 5 more mechanics. I don't know what I would do with this boss. I just hope that it's not tuned so it is tight as fuck, because it's not fun for anyone.
Moving on top of that, actually, very briefly, talking of tuning, melee on this fight do not have a very nice time on Mythic. The fact that, you have to do a lot of moving in and out, it leads to a lot of downtime. And there's also a weird thing with comp. When you're building for a comp raid leaders out there, just as a heads up, you really want to make it so there's an even amount of melee and ranged. Because otherwise you will have, the last two people to be assigned is going to be one melee person, one ranged person, and either that ranged is going to be dragged into melee, or that melee more likely is just going to be stood out there like, please come to the boss.
And also what we found, just to continue that point, is that the healers that are typically considered melee, so holy paladins and monks, they were considered ranged.
Yeah, so they couldn't really get the most out of their class without dragging a ranged player in, which if it stays the same, I just hope the assignment was wrong and they can switch that. But if that does say the same, then I can see this fight, literally you don't bring holy paladins because of that, because they're just not going to be as efficient because they can't hit the boss unless you're going to drag someone in, and good luck convincing a warlock to move. It's just not going to happen. They're like, no, I'm here to hit the boss. So, we'll have to see exactly how it plans out. There's a lot of big question marks about this fight. I hope that it turns out really, really good, but I do kind of agree. There's a really nasty world where this boss is going to really bring down the rest of the instance, and I don't mean physically by destroying the castle.
But thank you very much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this preview, then do drop us down a like. It helps us out a lot. If you want to be completely up to date with all of the bosses and all the new strategies as they come out, then do go check out our guides over on Wowhead. A link for that's in the description below. And as always, we'll have an updated guide for this encounter once it hits live servers in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you all in the next one.
Thanks for watching.